Last night, another city set on fire. Set on fire after there is an indictment that comes down for one police officer in the Breonna Taylor shooting. The indictment really was not because of the shooting at Breonna Taylor. It was because this officer fired wildly and hit an apartment wall. And so the idea was that he had misused his firearm. Now, as I've been talking about for a while, see, here on this show, we like to give you the facts of scenarios so you know what's coming. Probably a month ago, I went through the timeline of the Breonna Taylor killing, and I talked about the fact that while it was a tragedy, there was no law breaking, and it would be nearly impossible to make a case against any of the officers in Breonna Taylor's killing. That's specifically because they had a well-predicated warrant, a no-knock warrant for her apartment, the reason being that she was caught on tape talking with her ex-boyfriend about being involved in drug trafficking, apparently, about using her apartment as some sort of pass-through where he could pick up his mail. And the cops had a no-knock warrant on her apartment. When they arrived, they apparently knocked despite the no-knock warrant. And then her boyfriend got out of bed, and he didn't answer the door. He just apparently, as he was going to answer the door, he didn't know who it was, even though they said they were the police. He didn't hear them say they were the police. And then they bust through the door, at which point he has a gun on him, and he fires at the police. He hits one of the police officers. They fire back at him. And in the process of firing back at him, they kill Breonna Taylor, who was behind him. Okay, that is a tragedy, and it's a horrible tragedy. It does not mean a crime was committed. This was a well-predicated no-knock warrant. Even in order to prove there was a crime that was committed, what you would have to prove is that not only was the warrant bad, the cops knew the warrant was bad, and they decided to serve it anyway. And then they decided that they were going to act in violent measures with a bad warrant in order to hurt Breonna Taylor. And you can't prove any of those elements. The lawyers have been saying this for a long time on the Breonna Taylor case. And not just me. I'm talking about people on the left who have studied this case recognize that there was almost no chance of bringing a prosecution in this case. Again, because the timeline just does not lend itself to a prosecution in this case, because the cops didn't do anything criminal here. Just because something bad happens doesn't mean that the bad thing that happens involves violent lawbreaking. Bad things happen every day. That does not mean that the person who was involved in the bad thing is to blame when you are talking about criminal liability. Here's a brief timeline of what actually happened in the Breonna Taylor case. And see, here on the show, we like to talk about the facts of cases because it explains whether people's reactions are justified. I understand that in the media, everybody's reaction to any situation is justified just so long as it cuts against the narrative that America's good. If America is bad, your reaction is always justified. It doesn't matter if Breonna Taylor's officers actually, if the killers in the Breonna Taylor case, accidental killers in this case, if those people got off because they should get off, that doesn't matter. It is instead indicative of deeper American cruelty and racism. It doesn't matter if Michael Brown was shot justifiably. It does not matter if Jacob Blake was shot justifiably. It does not matter if Rayshard Brooks was shot justifiably. None of that matters. The only thing that matters to people who are in the media, apparently, is the narrative that America is bad, filled with racist cops, and every single law enforcement scenario that does not end with a cop going to jail is more evidence that America's cops are systemically racist and that America itself is shot through with 1619 style slavery-based racism. This is the take of the media. We don't do that here because it turns out that you usually want to link facts with the underlying narrative. Facts don't care about your narrative, you might say. The facts are what the facts are. Well, in this particular case, the facts demonstrate that the officers clearly should not have found themselves in the position of criminal liability with regard to the death of Breonna Taylor. Here is what the Louisville Courier-Journal had to say about the timeline. On December 30th, the police executed 3 search warrants in the Russell neighborhood, seizing several guns and narcotics. Among the 6 people subsequently arrested was Jamarcus Glover, Breonna Taylor's ex-boyfriend. On January 2nd, using a surveillance camera, police saw a white Chevy Impala pull up in front of 2424 Elliott Avenue, which is one of the houses hit with a search warrant a few days earlier. Glover got out of the passenger side of the car, registered to Taylor. Glover is seen driving to Taylor's Springfield Drive apartment and walking inside on January 16th. After a brief stay, police saw Glover leave with a suspected U.S. Postal Service package and then drive to a house on West Muhammad Ali Boulevard, which was also hit with a search warrant on December 30th. On February 14th, after an officer towed his car from West Muhammad Ali Boulevard, Glover attempted to file a complaint against the officer. The phone number he gave on the complaint was registered to Taylor. On March 12th, the warrants were set in motion. As of midday, Detective Joshua Jones, an officer in the Place-Based Investigations Unit of the Criminal Interdiction Division, requested 5 no-knock search warrants from Circuit Judge Mary Shaw for an ongoing narcotics investigation. Okay, the warrants were predicated on a 39-page document demonstrating links between Glover and Taylor, including prison visits and prison phone calls between Taylor and Glover, in which they discussed the movement of packages, for example. At 12:25 p.m., Shaw signed off, that is the judge, on the affidavits for the first two warrants for houses at 2424 and 2425 Elliott Avenue, and then a few minutes later signed off on 2426 Elliott Avenue, and then another house at 2605 West Muhammad Ali Boulevard. And then a few minutes after that, the judge signed off on the search of Taylor's apartment, which was 10 miles away in South Louisville. Why? Well, because in the affidavit, the officer wrote that Glover's car had made frequent trips to Taylor's Springfield Drive apartment, that Glover walked directly into Taylor's apartment on January 16th. A U.S. Postal inspector verified that Glover did receive packages at Taylor's apartment. Remember, Glover was running a drug trade. Taylor's car had been seen in front of the Elliott Avenue on different occasions. At approximately 9 p.m., Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, this is not her ex-boyfriend, Jamarcus Glover was her ex-boyfriend. Her new boyfriend was Kenneth Walker, who, by the way, was friends with Glover, apparently. Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, get home from dinner at Texas Roadhouse and giving a friend's kids rides across town. It was Taylor's first night off after a few consecutive days with 12-hour shifts as an ER technician. They climbed in bed, put on a movie. At approximately 10 p.m., police officers were briefed on the entry plan for Taylor's apartment. Just before midnight, about 45 minutes before serving the warrant, Mattingly said he drove by Taylor's apartment while another officer, Detective Mike Campbell, had an eye on the house. The only thing Campbell saw while watching Taylor's apartment, according to Mattingly, was the light on the TV in the bedroom. Police thought Taylor would be home alone. Inside the apartment, Taylor had fallen asleep watching the movie Freedom Writers, and Walker said he was starting to doze off. At 12:40 a.m., officers were in place outside Taylor's apartment and began to knock on the door. Remember, they didn't have to knock on the door because it was a no-knock warrant. After a few knocks, Mattingly said they began to identify themselves as police. There's at least one witness who said they identified as police. There were other witnesses who apparently said that they didn't hear them identify as police. They had no legal obligation to identify themselves as police. You may not like no-knock warrants, but this is a legal procedure in Louisville. The knocking startled Taylor and Walker out of bed. They began yelling out. So originally we were told, by the way, that Breonna Taylor was completely asleep. She was not. That is only relevant insofar as they did not just shoot a sleeping woman who was lying in bed. She apparently was behind him while she was awake. The knocking startled Taylor and Walker out of bed. They began yelling out, asking who was there, according to Walker, and they didn't hear a response, supposedly. After about a minute and hearing no response from inside, police used a battering ram to knock in the front door. So this is where the discrepancies begin between Walker's account and the police's account. And so Walker says he's yelling, who's there? And the police say we didn't hear him. So maybe they didn't hear him because the door's so thick, or maybe they didn't yell out because he was getting a gun. After a minute and hearing no response from inside, police used a battering ram to knock in the front door. Walker had grabbed his gun as both he and Taylor pulled on clothes and went to answer the door. They left the bedroom. They hadn't made it down the hallway before the door started coming off its hinges. At 12:42 a.m., neighbors in the St. Anthony Garden Apartments called 911 to report gunshots. Walker said he fired one shot as a warning aimed at the ground, but that isn't true because he actually shot one of the police officers in the leg. Officers on the scene called dispatch to report that an officer had been shot at 12:43. Taylor was struck in the return fire by police. At 12:47 a.m., Walker himself called 911 and said somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend. At 12:48, that was Taylor's official time of death. 10 miles away, police were simultaneously raiding Glover's apartment, that was her ex-boyfriend, and 3 of his associates, and they had him in custody. They seized drugs, guns, and cash from those Elliott Avenue properties. The 5th warrant on West Muhammad Ali Boulevard was not executed. Police arrested Walker after commanding him to walk backwards as he left the apartment. At 1:10 a.m., police told dispatch there was a woman inside of the apartment. At 1:46 a.m., EMS left Taylor's apartment complex. Inside of Taylor's apartment, they found shell casings and bullets, but no drugs and no cash, although they did find mail for Glover, who again was the target of the narcotics investigation, and the warrants were predicated on the idea that Taylor had been working with Glover and receiving mail on his behalf. Okay, so here's the bottom line. This is a tragedy. Is that a law violation by the legal officers who are tasked with breaking up a drug ring? Is that a legal violation by them? Not, do you like no-knock warrants? That's not the question. I think that there's a case to be made against no-knock warrants, particularly in low-level drug cases. I think the case is fairly good, actually. But does that mean that the police officers who were fired upon and returned fire and killed Breonna Taylor in the crossfire, that those officers are guilty of murder or manslaughter? Remember, the officers broke through the door on a legally predicated warrant and they were shot at. Once they are shot at, they are going to return fire. By the way, the person who shot at them, Walker, originally he was charged with attempting to shoot a police officer, and then they dropped the charges after it became clear that Taylor was dead and there was going to be a lot of blowback. We still don't know the full circumstances surrounding what exactly happened in that apartment. What we do know is that if you fire on police officers, they're going to fire back at you. So whether he thought that he was firing at just a rando who was breaking down his door, or whether he thought he was firing at the police, tragedy, not crime. Okay, and this is exactly the finding of the Louisville AG, of the Kentucky AG. Nonetheless, the city burns because the narrative does not matter. The narrative is the only thing that matters, rather. The facts do not matter whatsoever. The facts don't matter one iota to people who wish to burn things and pretend that every fact pattern is indicative of deeper American cruelty and bigotry. Now wait, before you go, you have to know we are moving YouTube channels. Videos like this one will only be available on my personal YouTube channel, Ben Shapiro, starting September 28th. Click on the link in the description to subscribe so you don't miss a beat.